What's up, guys? Welcome to this new video. Today I wanted to talk about maximum lactate steady state, critical power, FTP, all of the above. Um, Last week, what was it, Friday, I did what I thought was going to be a threshold session for myself on the bike. And I shared my lactate and heart rate numbers on Twitter and got some quality feedback from a lot of people, which I highly appreciate. And there, from that thread also emerged a pretty lengthy exchange between, how to say that, different proponents of different methods to um, distinguish the boundary between the heavy and the severe intensity domains, namely proponents of lactate testing, MLSS, and the likes. And then there's also the critical power model, the power duration relationship model that was put forward, um, and it's always an insightful exchange when those happen. I find them, at least, because I don't see myself as part as a camp or another, simply because I probably don't have enough experience to actually have uh, a fully anchored in opinion about either of those, if we want to call them sides, if I may call them sides, or options or perspectives. I think obviously they're not the same thing, right? Critical power does describe the boundary that separates internally steady state and internally non-steady state states, I guess, of effort. That makes quite a bit of sense to me, especially if it's derived from multiple tests, such as the five, or I think they usually use five now, I believe, when doing the studies, and the study from Jones and Al talking about different reactions, and they look at phosphocreatine, and they look at pH, and they look at ADP and other metabolites, and how these behave below and above critical power. I believe it's 5%, or is it 5% or 5 watts above and below? I believe it's 5%. But I might be wrong on that, so don't quote me. But anyway, there's a fairly distinct reaction above and below that boundary. So it does make sense to me that this delineates the boundary between those two intensity domains. And then there's MLSS, which at face value I have a problem with, quote unquote. Again, I'm still learning all those things, so it's just my perspective. Nothing more than that. I have a problem at face value simply because the measurement method is arbitrary. I don't say that pejoratively, but the fact that it's a 30-minute test and we're taking lactate at minute 10 and minute 30, why? Why is it on a 30-minute test? Why is it at minute 10 and 30? Why is it not minute 20 and 30? Why is it 1 millimole increase? Why is it not 0.5? Why is it not 2? So that's kind of what I find a little bit arbitrary about MLSS as a measurement. Um, Added to the fact that it's not very practical to determine, although the same could be said of critical power if we were to use 3, 4, or 5 trials. Um, Now I think things are getting to the point where you can use, training data, race data to try and establish that model, which makes a bit more sense than having to do all those efforts in training, which essentially you lose a week of training, which isn't a very good way to go for anybody, especially not at the highest level. Um, However, it's still what I see from my perspective is that both of those approaches are still being used by some of the best in high level sports, both on the critical power side and on the MLSS side. Um, And although they don't mean exactly the same thing, and they're usually not equivalent to one another, not perfectly at least. There's a good paper by, I think it was Jones again, that looked at uh, trying to reconcile critical power and MLSS by essentially modifying how MLSS would be defined. And I think it was if you take I think lactate at minute 20 and then 30 instead of 10 and 30, then you get a value that's much closer to critical power, um, which I find interesting. The idea of trying to make concepts match or merge. It's not really merging, but matching, so that no matter who's using what, we can we know what they're talking about and what they represent. But at the end of the day, um, the application of the numbers that you get out of those different tests, that's really what matters, right? Because whether you get critical power and you know that you should work at 90%, or you get an MLSS and you know you should work at 100% or 95% of MLSS, at the end of the day, you're in the same area, and your training is gonna most likely yield the same or very similar adaptations. So I don't even I don't even I don't know if I see it as a worthwhile debate as such to say who's right and who's wrong. Again, there's proponents of both, and those people all evolve at a high level in sports. So I don't see why we couldn't use one or the other. Maybe there's probably practical considerations. One of those methods might be better for one situation versus another. It might also depend, obviously, on the skill of the coaches or the physiologists that work with the different athletes, and what they're comfortable with and what models they apply. I mean, everybody bashes oftentimes bashes FTP. That being said, I'm sure there's still a lot of people that do great using that as a metric. Obviously, it's probably a good estimation of that fatigue threshold, for somebody who doesn't have access to anything else and doesn't want to do multiple tests and doesn't want to go to a lab. At some point, you have to go a little bit farther, I'm sure, if you want to, evolve to the next level in your development as an athlete. And using more individualized approaches is going to be better. And so knowing what your values are, knowing what your VO2 max is, knowing what your either critical power or MLSS is, or lactate threshold 2, knowing what your first threshold is, that's probably, in my mind, one of the most important ones to optimize training intensity distribution, simply because pretty much regardless of your discipline or event, you're going to be spending massive amounts of time, if you're training a lot, massive amounts of time in the moderate intensity domain. And you better know where that domain is for you, because otherwise that could, one, the training is not going to be as effective if you're above, and two, it's going to be more costly from a fatigue perspective. So you're getting less out of it with a higher cost, essentially, to keep things extremely simple. And so it does make sense to me to have a solid first threshold measurement, whether it's from a ventilatory threshold or a lactate threshold. Um, Obviously, for people that don't have that, taking a percent, what I've been interested in is looking at percentages of, for example, critical power for your first threshold. And obviously, there's going to be huge variation between different people, depending on your background, depending on your endurance level. Um, Probably mostly based on that. How many hours of properly calibrated zone 2 have you done per week in the last 3 months is probably a good starting point to determine what percentage somebody should use of critical power for their low intensity work if they don't have an actual measurement of their first threshold. But again, it's going to vary, and maybe what comes into play there is rate of perceived exertion, or just paying attention to how your body feels. because I can definitely tell the difference now that I know that I've done. I'm lucky that I have all those measuring devices, so I can kind of play with those and learn from them. But I know what it feels like when I've gone just a little bit too fast or too long on a what was supposed to be low intensity ride. And I can probably tell you when my lactate is starting to rise simply due to how my legs feel. So I think that has to come into play as well, right? We have to measure, we have to know, but then we have to feel as well. And somebody who knows all their measurements by heart, but then doesn't have any awareness whatsoever of how their body functions, well, they're not going to do as well, because they're not going to be able to adjust on the fly. They're not going to be able to say from a day to day, from a week to week, oh, I feel like I need some rest. So self-awareness is probably self-awareness superimposed onto one of those models of determining training intensity distribution is probably where the rubber hits the road, right? You could have a slightly imperfect method, but then if it's applied really well and you have a very an athlete who's very aware and can give you really high quality feedback on the sessions and what they're feeling and how things are going, you can probably do a lot of good work. But then you could have the quote unquote best model, but then applied suboptimally and with no awareness and feedback of the athlete, and you probably will do worse than in the first instance. So that's probably my conclusion of this quote unquote debate, is that both methods or different methods have their own merits, and I feel like we're in the end always playing with a moving target anyway, given the complex and changing nature of human physiology. So is there something that's actually more accurate than something else? If I had to bet on one of those horses, I would probably bet on critical power, simply from what I've seen in the literature and in the application on the field as well. But again, I'm not an expert here, so that's really just my opinion more than anything else. And I'd be happy to hear your opinion in the comments below. So yeah, let me know what you think about this whole rigmarole. It was fun. It was very fun. And like I said, I always learn so much when those things happen and you post one tweet and then 100 tweets emerge from that tweet, and with different perspectives and inputs. And I find it very interesting. You have to just sift through some stuff, obviously, as always on social media, but I always come out with a net positive. So I'd be interested to hear what you thought of this. I'll post the actual tweet in the description below if you want to go check out the thread that emerged from this little question that I asked. And then, yeah, if you have a comment, leave it below. Make sure you leave a little like on the video if you appreciate this kind of content. Like I said, I've been trying to, and I'm going to work on doing more content in English, hopefully daily. And I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care.